Executive Director of the Interstate Informed Citizens Coalition. Sir, welcome. Push that red button in front of you before you speak, and we'll be all set.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
As the projector warms up, my name is Kevin Martis. I'm the Executive Director of the Interstate Informed Citizens Coalition. We're a bipartisan renewable energy citizens watchdog group. We represent thousands of people living on what I call the receiving end of PA 295. Our people know exactly what renewable energy mandates look like from the ground floor. So I speak on their behalf today. I'm a volunteer director. I've taken the day off work to be here. I'm not compensated for any of my opinions. Our group is about 40% Democrats, 60% Republicans. And so I think we bring an independent and neutral voice here. We certainly have no means to profit from anything we have to say today. And I'll get busy. Many of the following points that I'm going to make are in the packet that I presented to you. We presented an extensive response to the rough draft of the Ready Michigan report. We endorse a number of its conclusions. We also have a number of objections, and I'll just detail them here. First of all, we agree with the report that wind turbines can make people ill. This is the Kaplinski home in Huron County. This family has built a bunker in their basement. They've converted a cistern into a bunker so they can avoid the low frequency noise. So we do agree with the Ready Michigan report that wind turbine noise can cause problems. We also agree, this is Missaukee County. I'll make an interesting point. Sherman Township is very near this area. NextEra Energy is back trying to build wind in Sherman Township. The voters have twice rejected permissive wind zoning in Sherman Township by referendum at the ballot box, but NextEra is back trying a third time. That's what it's like to live inside a township that's targeted by an industrial wind developer. Wind has worked very well for NextEra. Their corporate tax rate in the last few years has been about 1.25%. I would love to have paid only that much. Here's the reality of PA 295. This is in Ludington, Michigan. I just talked to this family last week. That turbine is 500 feet closer to the home than the manufacturer says employees should be without protective hard hat and clothing. Their two sons just came home from college for spring break. Their parents sleep in the basement. They spent one night there and said, Mom and Dad, we wanted to stay the whole week, but we can't sleep in our bedrooms anymore, so they've gone elsewhere for the rest of their spring break. That's what PA 295 looks like on the ground. So we do agree with this report from the state that Michigan wind is too noisy. And we agree when it says it would be advisable for any new project to attempt to maintain a mean sound level of 40 decibels or lower. Most wind developers show up asking for 50 or 55 decibels. We think the state is very wise to recommend this new number. Heritage Wind has constructed a project in the Garden Peninsula, and I won't read this to you, but it's a petition that 73 residents of that wind plant in the Garden Peninsula have sent to their zoning board asking for relief from the noise. You can read it yourself. In the interest of time, I won't. There's a copy of their handwritten signatures asking for relief. Now, they weren't the only ones that objected. Fish and Wildlife objected to the Garden Peninsula development as well. Their letter to Heritage Energy said, based on the data currently available, we must again recommend that you not construct a commercial wind development on the Garden Peninsula because of the high potential for avian mortalities and violations of federal wildlife laws. Fish and Wildlife objected, Heritage built. Further, we agree that PA 295's in-state mandate is unconstitutional. You don't have to trust me, and I'm sure you would not. Michigan cannot, according to Richard Posner of the Seventh Circuit, without violating the Commerce Clause of Article 1 of the Constitution, discriminate against out-of-state renewable energy. PA 295, as it stands, like many of the in-state mandates the wind lobby pushed in 2008, is in fact unconstitutional. So what does that mean? Well, right now, PA 295 is depriving our utilities and co-ops of their constitutional right to acquire $30 per megawatt hour Iowa wind and forcing them to buy $76 per megawatt hour Michigan wind. And without that illegal in-state mandate, there is no longer a mechanism to force Michigan green jobs creation. That already dubious justification for RPS mandates is dead. Michigan are like #1 and #2 in the country for the number of wind-related manufacturing facilities. But we have a very small amount of wind. You would think that if wind projects built inside your state created green jobs, Iowa and Texas would be number one. There is no connection between in-state mandates and alleged green jobs. We also agree with the Ready Michigan report when it says comparing the cost of new renewables to other types of new generation should be done with caution. The most dishonest feature of PA 295 was that it required an annual cost comparison between coal and wind. Since you can't replace a coal plant with wind turbines alone, that is an economically invalid comparison. Besides, advanced coal with carbon capture and sequestration does not exist commercially. The latest report from MPSC, and this was due to our efforts lobbying MPSC and other interest groups, has finally inserted this important corrective paragraph that says, while the Commission is required to make a determination about the cost effectiveness of wind versus coal, it should be noted that renewable energy wind resources are not equivalent on a capacity basis when compared to coal-fired or other baseload generations. Thus, my statement now, the persistent media claims of wind boosters that wind is now cheaper than coal is shown to be nonsense. It has the economic merit of claiming a team of oxen is cheaper than a tractor. Another thing people often don't understand is there's no such thing as wind by itself. We routinely hear people say, I would rather see a wind turbine than a coal, gas, or nuclear plant. But the truth is that wind by itself cannot replace conventional generators due to intermittency of fuel, the wind. It requires flexible fossil generation to be present at all times. In Michigan, this means coal or gas, but most often gas. We hear a lot of talk about the cost of wind relative to other sources, but if you look at things more honestly, we'll see that wind is about $150 a megawatt hour. And as a matter of state policy, the issue that we have with that is that's more expensive than any other means of generating electricity, including nuclear. Nuclear, in fact, is far cheaper than wind over a 60-year life cycle and reduces emissions 100%. Now, some will argue that wind doesn't need to be added with gas generation, but General Electric reported to the White House in 2012 they were concerned about the new proposed emissions regulations on CO2, 1,000 pounds per megawatt hour. GE said to the White House, look, if flexible generation assets such as gas turbines are not available, renewable technologies will not be deployed. In other words, gas turbines are an essential component of renewable energy sources' ability to penetrate the market. So what you need to understand as policymakers is that large wind mandates are large gas mandates. They also may require capacity payments to gas generators because as you shift revenue away from that gas plant, who's dependent on future revenue to be economically viable, and give it to wind, you still have to have that plant there. At some point, ratepayers will have to pay them not to produce. What this means for the environmentalists in the IICC is that a wind mandate is in fact a fracking mandate. Now what about this discussion of 30% renewables? I know Commissioner Quackenbush and Director McCall testified a few weeks ago. They referred to the PJM Renewable Integration Study showing that we could get 30% renewable energy into PJM. Well, the IICC agrees, sort of. Yes, we could squeeze 30% wind into Michigan in the same way that we could get 30% of our electricity from bicycle generators. You would have to ignore any reasonable cost and benefit analysis of both the economic and environmental outcomes. This is the most important question before us as citizens and as policymakers. Since these reports do not address cost-benefit analysis of wind, they are largely useless as tools for policy. Here's just one issue that's not discussed in depth in the PJM report, for instance. That's Iowa's wind, who's in MISO with us, and there's Michigan's wind. As you can see, Iowa's wind is far superior to Michigan wind. In fact, every turbine you build in Iowa has access to twice as much energy as the turbine in Michigan. Secondly, the turbines in Michigan are significantly more expensive to construct. We can never catch Iowa in the race for wind energy. It would be like trying to build a hydro generating capacity on the Grand River and competing with the Mississippi. It doesn't work. Interestingly, the Oklahoma Senate just passed a moratorium against any new wind generation in the eastern half of the state, citing poor wind resource. Well, if you look at the map, you'll see the eastern half of their state actually has a superior wind resource to Michigan. It's as if they said, if our wind is only a little better than Michigan's, there's no sense of building there. And we often hear that new taller turbines will make Michigan wind competitive, but you see over time since 1996, no matter the state of advancement in turbine technology, Iowa wind is always cheaper than Michigan wind and will remain so. It only makes sense. Their wind has more energy. When it comes to coal emissions, we see that Iowa has, in 2010, 16% wind, yet their coal emissions rose every year. They're now up to 24% wind. Almost all that wind is being exported to other states. Curiously, Michigan is forced to pay for new transmission upgrades in MISO, but our RPS mandate prohibits us from purchasing cheap wind energy from Iowa and Minnesota, even though we have to pay to transport it here. And we see, here's another problem that's difficult to fix with wind. When the price is high and demand for electricity is high, wind is not available. And when the price of electricity is low, like at night, wind is readily available and abundant. It's inverse to demand. It's a very low value commodity. And Detroit Edison and Consumers Energy both offered comments on the draft report on renewable energy, and they said, look, wind PPA costs cited in the Ready, Michigan report of $50 to $60 are benefiting from the production tax credit, which many observers do not expect to be renewed going forward, and which artificially lower the price of wind generation. The federal PTC is now expired. The price of wind in Michigan has now risen $23 to $35 a megawatt hour. Here's the most troubling thing. The purpose of PA 295 was to clean our air and give us clean and cheaper electricity. But despite that declared intent, there was no requirement to empirically measure air quality improvements directly attributable to PA 295, nor to perform a cost-benefit analysis of forcing renewables into Michigan's generation portfolio. The Ready, Michigan report repeats this error. The truth is, for every dollar spent on wind, if CO2 is your demon du jour, 10 times more CO2 reductions could be achieved by building combined cycle gas turbines alone. Again, you don't have to take my word for it. The National Academy of Sciences, which is very concerned about anthropogenic global warming, says if the revenue loss as a result of the PTC is divided by the reduction in CO2, just under $250 in revenues are lost per ton of CO2 reduced. This is high relative to other more efficient approaches. So is 30% wind in Michigan really achievable? To achieve 30% net wind, we would have to build wind nameplate capacity equal to roughly 100% of our existing thermal generation, because wind only produces about 30% of its maximum. Michigan would need to build 7,000 1.8 megawatt turbines to generate 30% net from wind. This is one turbine for every 5 square miles of the Lower Peninsula on average. 7,000 turbines would cost at least $28 billion, not counting substantial new transmission, gas generating capacity, etc. Further, those $28 billion in wind turbines would have to be replaced every 22 years or so, according to Detroit Edison. They will be worn out. That makes wind an atrocious environmental value. $28 billion of wind is enough to replace all 5,000 megawatts of our dirtiest coal plants with emissions-free nuclear located on existing brownfields using existing transmission, and they'll last more than 60 years. And if we build gas instead of wind, for $28 billion, we could close almost every coal plant in the Midwest, slashing CO2 by half, and our fine particulate mercury emissions in the Midwest from generation would drop to almost zero. If you build wind, you get at best a 30% reduction. You can't even guarantee the bulk of it comes in the state. The bottom line is, we could have closed half our dirtiest coal plants with what we've spent on wind so far. At best, we've reduced coal emissions by 2.2%, but likely far less. We could have cut them by half already with what we spent today. Wind generation is simply an expensive fuel-saving accessory one can add to existing fossil generation. It is not a replacement. Those 20-year fixed-price Michigan wind PPAs for $50 to $108 are saving $25 to $35 worth of fuel. That is all. Wind is an uneconomic hedge for gas prices. In summary, PA 295 has forced ratepayers to maintain and purchase and erect $2.5 billion worth of wind that have reduced emissions by only a trivial amount. Yet they generate very expensive and poor quality electricity that arrives at times at lowest demand and lowest value, even as it drives up the cost of the dispatchable generators necessary to keep the lights on. Percentage goals or mandates. I've heard a lot of talk around town that maybe we're going to look at some kind of goals for the future. If Michigan had the hydro resources of Idaho, a high percentage of renewables would be fantastic. But our 7-year experiment with forcing high-cost, low-quality wind energy into Michigan has proven that the only percentage goal that makes sense for Michigan ratepayers and their environment is zero. Anything more than zero is simply a forced ratepayer handout to the wind lobby. A better solution. If a goal of Michigan energy policy is to reduce coal emissions, we should reward the technology that brings those emissions reductions to the market in the shortest amount of time and for the lowest cost, and to require empirical measurement of those reductions so that a proper cost-benefit analysis can be performed. Michigan's non-hydro renewables fail that test. Further, since 2008, we have learned that disruptive technology like the shale gas revolution and heavy EPA regulations make state RPS mandates now largely irrelevant. In fact, Senator Hopwood and I first discussed this together when I met with him last fall. The utilities must begin replacing coal with gas or nuclear irrespective of state policy. That change is coming. Their emissions will continue to quickly drop as a result. That's the good news. And since gas and nuclear both reduce emissions far more cheaply than wind, it is our advice that the state should simply stay out of the way. Finally, an analogy. I'm a general contractor. Subsidizing wind energy is like hiring one of my teenage sons to work in my construction business. They're seldom there when there is real work to be done. When they do show up, they have a highly inflated opinion of their relative contribution to the task at hand. Nevertheless, they demand to be paid far more than their adult coworkers for their juvenile efforts. And they then reward you by keeping you up all night with incessant and annoying noise that you are absolutely powerless to stop. Now, what's the right percentage goal for that? The supporters of the IICC have come to Lansing and are asking you just one thing. Please protect us from bad energy policy. I would be glad to take any questions.
Very much, Senator Walker.
Just want to thank you for your testimony. Just wanted to give a copy of this presentation.
Absolutely. I did email it to Greg, so I think he can forward it.
Thank you.
Senator Young.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Correct me if I'm wrong, but did you say that you were in support of nuclear and other such power?
I'm actually here not to advocate for any form. I'm here to say we only have a few options.
Okay.
Wind, coal, gas, coal, or nuclear, and then you can add wind to gas or coal. Those are your options.
The reason why I say that is because in my district in South Detroit, 48217, it is the most polluted area in the state. And it has the only oil refinery in the country, in the state, in America.
Sure.
What do you say to those people who are in my community, who I have senior citizens who have to use breathing respirators to be able to breathe air? I have kids that are playing soccer in air that, quite frankly, smells like a sock over there, and it's unhealthy for them to be there. What do you say to them when we talk about, alternative clean energy that might actually give them an opportunity just to be able to breathe clean air, which I also thought was a God-given American fundamental right in this country?
Absolutely, Senator. First of all, I'm not here to address emissions from refineries, and we don't use oil to make electricity in the state of Michigan in any substantial degree. But if those are coal plant emissions that are affecting your constituents, then I'm going to be very frank. Your constituents should be mad as hell that we've spent $2.5 billion on windmills when we could have stopped those emissions already in your district by building combined cycle gas instead of coal. Combined cycle does not emit any mercury, does not emit any fine particulates. Their health could have already been protected in exchange for what we have already spent. And that offends me as an environmentalist too, sir.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Senator Beaker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your testimony. Could you just tell us a little bit about your organization? I've never heard of it before, and how did it start? And I mean, that's maybe my fault. But, if you could just tell us a little bit how you started and what the background is, how you funded all of those things.
Sure. Well, the funding's easy. I'm funded by organized labor. My wife is a union nurse, and that's how I'm able to be here today. She works so I can testify. We are a union household. Our funding is trivial. We are volunteers from across the state. We have people who support us from every part of the state, many who are living inside wind development. That's where most of us first discovered that energy policy becomes very important when it's proposed for your community. Just as Senator Young has pointed out, coal emissions have an impact in that neighborhood. Wind plants create emissions as well. In this case, it's noise pollution. So that's how we got involved in this.
Just how long have you been around?
How long has the IICC been around? Since 2011.